German prisoners of war entered American camps prepared for brutality, but what unsettled them most was the absence of it, because nothing is more dangerous to a soldier than realizing everything he was taught might be wrong. Inside the camps, there were no beatings, no shouted orders tearing through the night, and no visible cruelty to fight against. And yet this calm structure, with its schedules, quiet rules, and controlled silence, became deeply disturbing for many German prisoners because when captivity removes fear and replaces it with order, the mind is left without resistance, forced to confront questions it can no longer escape about the enemy, the war, and the beliefs that had shaped them long before. Capture. When German prisoners of war first arrived at American camps, many were mentally prepared for an immediate confrontation with brutality, because captivity, as they understood it, was supposed to begin with intimidation, confusion, and the stripping away of dignity. Transport had already taken its toll, leaving men exhausted from long journeys across oceans and rail lines, uncertain of where they were and what awaited them beyond the final checkpoint. Instead of chaos, they encountered procedure. Guards directed movements calmly. Instructions were delivered without shouting, and processing unfolded with an efficiency that felt impersonal rather than hostile. Names were recorded, personal items cataloged, and medical checks conducted as part of standardized intake. This administrative tone created an early sense of unease as prisoners searched instinctively for threats that did not appear. The absence of violence was not immediately reassuring. Years of training and propaganda had prepared them to recognize danger through aggression, not order. When no physical punishment followed arrival, many prisoners remained tense, waiting for the moment when treatment would change. That moment did not come. Instead, they were guided through routines that emphasized control through predictability. Barracks assignments followed. Prisoners were led to long wooden buildings arranged with precision, each interior organized around rows of beds and designated walking paths. Space was clearly defined, and movement was regulated by schedule rather than force. This structure removed uncertainty about daily life, but it also eliminated opportunities to resist visibly. Without chaos, there was nothing to push against. Guards maintained distance. Their presence was constant but restrained, reinforcing authority through visibility rather than confrontation. Rules were posted and repeated consistently, making expectations clear. Compliance did not feel like surrender. It felt like participation in a system that functioned regardless of individual emotion. For many prisoners, this environment produced cognitive tension. The lack of immediate suffering contradicted everything they had anticipated. Fear, once a constant companion, had no obvious trigger. The mind, conditioned to respond to danger, struggled to adapt to an atmosphere where order replaced threat. As the first day progressed, prisoners observed the camp's rhythm. Meals were distributed on schedule, work details were assigned methodically, and rest periods were enforced uniformly. Each action reinforced the impression that captivity here was designed to be sustainable, not chaotic. This realization marked a subtle shift in perception as prisoners began to understand that endurance would be measured differently. Nightfall intensified this awareness. Lights dimmed at a set hour, conversation faded, and the camp settled into controlled silence. There were no sudden inspections, no displays of force meant to unsettle. Instead, the quiet extended uninterrupted, leaving prisoners alone with thoughts they had expected to suppress through survival instincts. This silence carried weight. Without external pressure, attention turned inward. Questions emerged quietly, not about immediate survival, but about meaning and expectation. Why was captivity unfolding this way? And what did it imply about the enemy, the war, and the narratives that had shaped belief? By the end of the first night, Many German prisoners recognized that American captivity would not challenge them through constant fear or physical deprivation. Instead, it would test patience, adaptation, and psychological endurance. Control was present, but it operated subtly, embedded in routine, and reinforced through repetition. This realization did not bring comfort. It replaced one form of uncertainty with another. The struggle ahead would not be against visible cruelty, but against time, structure, and the quiet pressure of a system designed to persist. In this environment, resistance would not be dramatic. It would be internal, gradual, and largely invisible, shaping the experience of captivity from the very first day. As German prisoners of war settled into American camps, it became increasingly clear that authority here did not depend on intimidation, but on order that left little room for unpredictability. Each day unfolded according to a fixed structure, one that began early and moved forward without urgency, yet without deviation. This consistency removed the tension of surprise, replacing it with a rhythm that shaped behavior quietly. Schedules governed movement. Wake-up times, meals, work details, and rest periods followed a predictable sequence posted clearly and enforced evenly. Prisoners were not rushed, nor were they left idle without direction. This balance between activity and restraint created an environment where compliance emerged naturally, not through fear, but through repetition. Rules were communicated plainly. There was little ambiguity about what was allowed and what was not. Violations were addressed methodically, often without visible anger or escalation. The absence of dramatic punishment made discipline feel administrative rather than personal, reducing emotional resistance while reinforcing authority. For many prisoners, this system proved more unsettling than aggression. Violence could be anticipated and endured. Order, however, demanded adaptation. Without a clear enemy to resist, frustration had nowhere to go. The structure absorbed it, dispersing tension across routine tasks and scheduled time. Work assignments reinforced this dynamic. Prisoners were organized into groups and given tasks that served the camp's maintenance and surrounding economy. Labor was regulated, supervised, and measured. Effort was expected, but exhaustion was not the goal. Work filled hours without overwhelming the body, preventing both idleness and rebellion. This approach created a sense of normalcy that felt unnatural in captivity. Days resembled civilian routines more than military confinement. The mind, trained to associate imprisonment with suffering, struggled to reconcile this experience with expectations formed during war. Guards maintained distance, interacting through instruction rather than confrontation. Their authority was visible but restrained, reinforcing the impression that control did not require constant assertion. Presence alone was sufficient. This restraint reduced opportunities for conflict, making defiance feel pointless. As weeks passed, prisoners internalized the system. Movement aligned with schedules automatically, and tasks were completed without constant supervision. Habit replaced vigilance. The camp functioned smoothly, not because prisoners were broken, but because the environment left little space for disruption. This gradual adaptation carried psychological consequences. The loss of fear did not bring relief. It introduced ambiguity. Prisoners were forced to confront captivity without the emotional clarity that suffering provides. Questions shifted from survival to meaning, from resistance to endurance. Order, once perceived as benign, revealed its power. It shaped behavior quietly, guiding actions through expectation rather than threat. Time became the primary instrument of control, stretching days into weeks and weeks into months, each governed by the same routine. By the end of this phase, German prisoners understood that American captivity operated on a different logic. Authority was sustained through consistency, not cruelty. Fear was replaced with structure, and in that structure, endurance became the defining challenge. The system did not seek to break the prisoner quickly, but to hold him steadily, allowing time itself to do the work. As order settled into permanence, German prisoners of war began to experience a different kind of strain, one that did not announce itself through pain or fear, but through repetition and normality. Days no longer felt uncertain. They felt identical. Morning followed night with mechanical consistency, and each task blended into the next without distinction. This sameness created a subtle psychological weight. In the absence of crisis, the mind searched for meaning and found none that offered resolution. Time stretched without markers of progress, turning endurance into the primary challenge. Survival no longer required alertness or resistance. It required patience. The camp's routines reinforced this condition. Meals arrived on schedule, work details filled the hours, and rest periods closed the day with predictable silence. There were no sudden changes to disrupt expectation. This stability removed both fear and hope, replacing them with continuity. For many prisoners, this was more difficult to process than hardship. Normality also blurred identity. Soldiers accustomed to defining themselves through action and conflict found their roles reduced to tasks and schedules. Without the pressures of combat or the immediacy of danger, the sense of purpose weakened. Prisoners were alive and functional, yet disconnected from the motivations that had once driven them. Social interaction reflected this shift. Conversations became quieter and more restrained, often centered on routine rather than future plans. Speculation about the war's outcome faded as days accumulated without new information. The absence of urgency dulled emotion, making anticipation feel distant and abstract. The system's quiet efficiency left little space for resistance. Without visible injustice or overt cruelty, opposition lacked direction. Compliance became the default, not because prisoners were convinced, but because alternatives felt meaningless. Resistance without consequence dissolved into fatigue. This environment forced introspection. With external threats removed, attention turned inward. Prisoners reflected on the war, their capture, and the beliefs that had guided them into conflict. Questions emerged slowly, shaped by time rather than confrontation. The enemy, once defined clearly, became more complex. For some, this introspection led to disillusionment. The contrast between expectation and experience unsettled deeply held assumptions. The calm structure of captivity challenged narratives of absolute hostility, introducing doubt where certainty had once existed. The psychological pressure of normality did not produce dramatic breakdowns. Instead, it wore down edges quietly. Emotions flattened, reactions slowed, and time lost urgency. Life continued, but without momentum. By this stage, German prisoners understood that captivity in America exerted control not through suffering, but through sustained normalcy. The absence of extremes removed reference points that defined struggle. Endurance became passive rather than active, shaped by routine rather than resistance. This phase marked a turning point. The initial shock of arrival had faded, replaced by a quieter realization that captivity would not be survived through courage alone, but through acceptance of time's slow passage. In this environment, the challenge was not to endure pain, but to remain mentally intact while nothing seemed to change. As weeks turned into months, German prisoners of war began to adapt to captivity in ways they had not anticipated, not through acts of resistance or submission, but through gradual accommodation to a system that left little room for either. Adaptation did not arrive as a decision. It emerged quietly, shaped by repetition and reinforced by the absence of alternatives. Routines that once felt foreign became automatic. Movements aligned with schedules without conscious effort, and tasks were completed with minimal reflection. The camp no longer demanded constant vigilance. Instead, it encouraged predictability, allowing prisoners to function without emotional engagement. This shift reduced friction, but it also dulled awareness. Adaptation altered perception of authority. Guards were no longer viewed solely as adversaries, but as fixtures within the system, predictable in behavior and limited in role. Their presence enforced boundaries without provoking confrontation. This consistency removed opportunities for conflict, making resistance feel impractical rather than dangerous. As resistance faded, so did urgency. The absence of immediate threat removed the need for defiance. Survival no longer depended on alertness or improvisation. It depended on compliance with routine. This form of control did not require force. It relied on time, repetition, and the gradual erosion of expectation. Psychologically, adaptation created distance from the outside world. Memories of home and war lost sharpness as daily life narrowed to the camp's boundaries. News, when it arrived, felt disconnected, filtered through layers of time and uncertainty. The war continued elsewhere, but within the camp, days unfolded without reference to its progress. This separation reinforced acceptance. Prisoners learned to focus on the immediate present rather than distant outcomes. Hope, once tied to victory or escape, became abstract. Release was no longer imagined actively. It was deferred to an undefined future shaped by forces beyond control. Adaptation also reshaped identity. Without roles defined by rank or mission, prisoners related to one another through shared routine rather than hierarchy. The camp flattened distinctions, replacing them with uniformity. Individual ambition diminished, giving way to collective endurance. This process did not involve surrender of belief. Rather, beliefs became irrelevant to daily survival. The system did not demand ideological change. It demanded participation. By meeting basic needs and maintaining order, it reduced the emotional energy available for resistance. Over time, this adaptation stabilized the camp environment. Compliance became habitual, not coerced. The absence of conflict reinforced the system's effectiveness, confirming that control through normalcy could succeed where intimidation might fail. By this stage, German prisoners understood that captivity in America did not aim to crush resistance quickly. It aimed to absorb it slowly. Adaptation replaced opposition, and routine replaced urgency. The challenge was no longer to endure hardship, but to recognize how quietly the system reshaped behavior without ever appearing to demand it. By the later stages of captivity, German prisoners of war came to understand that the most powerful force shaping their experience was neither guards nor fences, but time itself. Days continued without disruption, and weeks accumulated without clear markers of progress. The camp no longer felt threatening, yet offered no sense of forward movement. Life persisted in a controlled loop, sustained but unresolved. This prolonged stillness altered how prisoners measured endurance. In earlier phases, survival had been defined by physical resilience and mental alertness. Now, it was defined by the ability to exist within repetition without losing coherence. Time became something to be endured rather than managed, its passage marked only by routine and seasonal change. The absence of crisis created an unusual psychological state. Without immediate danger, emotions flattened. Relief did not arrive, but neither did despair. Instead, prisoners experienced a muted continuity, where anticipation faded and urgency dissolved. The future existed only as an abstract concept detached from daily experience. This condition reinforced the system's effectiveness. By removing extremes, the camp minimized disruption. Bodies remained healthy, routines continued uninterrupted, and order sustained itself without constant enforcement. Control operated invisibly, embedded in predictability rather than punishment. For many prisoners, reflection replaced action. With limited influence over their circumstances, they turned inward, reconsidering beliefs formed before capture. The contrast between expectation and reality prompted quiet reassessment. The enemy they had prepared to resist no longer matched the system they inhabited. This introspection did not necessarily lead to agreement or gratitude. Instead, it produced ambiguity. Captivity had not unfolded as imagined, and that discrepancy complicated narratives of victimhood and hostility. Survival had been ensured, but understanding remained incomplete. As the war approached its end, awareness of time intensified. Rumors circulated, information filtered slowly, and anticipation returned cautiously. Health, preserved throughout confinement, ensured that prisoners would outlast the conflict. Yet this preservation carried its own weight, emphasizing that release depended entirely on external events. Time revealed its final role as the ultimate authority. It dictated duration, enforced patience, and resolved captivity without confrontation. The system did not rush its conclusion. It waited. By the end of confinement, German prisoners recognized that American captivity had been defined less by force than by endurance. Time had shaped behavior, dulled resistance, and sustained order. Survival had not been contested violently. It had been maintained steadily, day after day, until history itself signaled an end. For German prisoners of war held in the United States, captivity unfolded in a way few had imagined. It was not defined by constant fear or visible cruelty, but by structure, routine, and time. Expectations shaped by war collapsed quietly as daily life settled into predictability, replacing confrontation with endurance. American camps demonstrated a form of control that did not rely on breaking the body, but on sustaining it. Health was preserved, order maintained, and resistance absorbed gradually through normalcy. The system functioned without urgency, allowing time to become the primary force shaping experience. This approach left a lasting psychological imprint. Survival was no longer measured by bravery or suffering, but by patience and adaptation. The absence of extremes forced reflection, challenging beliefs formed long before capture. Captivity became less about punishment and more about waiting within a controlled environment that offered stability without resolution. When the war ended and release finally came, many prisoners carried conflicting memories. They remembered fences and confinement, but also silence, routine, and an unexpected lack of brutality. The experience resisted simple interpretation, occupying a space between hardship and preservation. In the end, American captivity revealed that power does not always announce itself through force. Sometimes it operates quietly through order and time, shaping behavior without spectacle. For those who lived through it, survival was not a triumph over suffering, but an endurance of calm, sustained steadily until history itself brought the waiting to a close. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.